The crisp autumn morning wrapped around Darius Matthews like a familiar blanket as he adjusted his Postal Service badge, its worn edges catching the early sunlight. 23 years of delivering mail had etched the streets of Copper Hill into his mind like well-worn paths, each house holding its own story, each resident a character in the daily narrative of his route. Today, however, would write a chapter he never expected. The postal office buzzed with its usual morning energy as Darius sorted through his deliveries, his practiced hands moving with precision born of thousands of repetitions. Martha, his supervisor for the past decade, caught his eye from across the room and raised her coffee mug in their usual morning salute. The aroma of coffee and fresh paper mingled with the metallic smell of sorting machines, creating the distinctive scent that had become as much a part of his routine as breathing. "Looking sharp today, Darius," called out Joey, a rookie carrier still learning the ropes. The young man's enthusiasm reminded Darius of his own early days, when each delivery felt like a small adventure. "Thanks, kid," Darius replied, smoothing down his regulation blue shirt. The uniform might have been standard issue, but he wore it with the pride of someone who understood that being a mail carrier meant being a thread in the fabric of community life. His fingers traced the embroidered USPS eagle on his chest, a gesture that had become almost ritualistic over the years. As he loaded his truck, Darius mentally rehearsed his route, though he hardly needed to. The familiar weight of his bag settled against his shoulder as he climbed into the driver's seat, the worn leather conforming to his frame like a second skin. The morning sun painted Copper Hill in shades of gold and amber, the trees along Maple Street beginning their annual transformation into brilliant displays of red and orange. The first few hours of his route flowed with comfortable predictability. Mrs. Rivera's Chihuahua performed its daily performance of furious barking from behind the safety of her front window. Mr. Chun waved from his porch where he sat reading his morning paper, the same way he had every day since his retirement 3 years ago. The Rodriguez twins raced their bikes alongside Darius's truck for half a block, their laughter echoing off the houses like wind chimes. But as he turned onto Sycamore Lane, something felt different. The street seemed quieter than usual, the shadows a little longer, the air a little heavier. House number 1542 came into view, the Thompson residence. Sarah Thompson had been one of his regulars for nearly 2 decades, a retired schoolteacher whose carefully tended roses had won the local garden club's top prize 5 years running. Her house had always been a bright spot on his route, with its cheerful yellow paint and meticulously maintained flower beds. Today, however, the roses drooped unpruned, their spent blooms scattered across the lawn like fallen soldiers. Several days' worth of newspapers formed a small pile by the front steps, their plastic wrappings glinting in the morning light. The sight sent a small shiver down Darius's spine, despite the warmth of the day. He parked his truck and gathered Mrs. Thompson's mail, a few bills, what looked like a magazine, and several pieces of junk mail. As he walked up the cracked concrete path, he noticed other signs of neglect. Dead leaves collecting in corners, cobwebs stretching across the porch light, a garden hose left uncoiled across the walkway. The doorbell's chime seemed unusually loud in the morning stillness. Darius waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, straining to hear any movement inside. Just as he was about to ring again, he heard shuffling footsteps approaching the door. The woman who opened it barely resembled the Sarah Thompson he knew. Her silver hair, usually neatly styled, hung in uncombed strands around her face. Her clothes, what appeared to be pajama pants and an old cardigan, bore visible stains, and her normally bright eyes seemed clouded and uncertain. "Oh, Darius," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Is it morning already?" The question sent alarm bells ringing in Darius's mind. Mrs. Thompson had always been sharp as a tack, greeting him by name and often sharing observations about current events or asking about his family. Now she seemed disoriented, her gaze wandering past him to some distant point. "Yes, ma'am," he replied gently. "It's just past 10. I've got your mail here." He held out the bundle of envelopes, but she made no move to take them. That's when he noticed the dark stains on her pants, reddish-brown patches that made his heart skip a beat. "Mrs. Thompson," he said carefully. Are you feeling all right? She blinked slowly, as if trying to process the question. I'm fine, dear. Just a bit tired. Haven't been sleeping well, you see. She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Darius took a small step forward, trying to peer past her into the house. The usually immaculate entryway was strewn with clothes and papers. An overturned lamp lay on its side, its shade askew. The air that drifted out smelled stale and slightly medicinal. Maybe I could help you pick up these newspapers, he offered, gesturing to the pile by her feet. They shouldn't be left out here. Mrs. Thompson's hand trembled as she gripped the doorframe. No, I'll get to them. I just need to rest a bit more. Everything's fine, really. But everything was clearly not fine. As she shifted her weight, Darius noticed her wince, and the stains on her pants seemed to have spread. Making a split-second decision that would change both their lives, he pulled out his cell phone. Mrs. Thompson, I think you might need some help, he said firmly but kindly. I'm going to call someone who can make sure you're okay. Will you let me do that for you? Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, the confusion cleared, replaced by a look of profound relief. She nodded almost imperceptibly as her shoulders sagged, as if a great weight was finally being lifted. Darius dialed 911, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he waited for the dispatcher to answer, he gently guided Mrs. Thompson to sit on her porch swing, keeping one hand on her elbow to steady her. The chains creaked softly, a sound that reminded him of countless pleasant conversations they'd shared on this very spot over the years. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was clear and professional. Yes, I'm a mail carrier on Sycamore Lane, Darius began, his voice calm despite his racing heart. I'm at the home of Sarah Thompson, 1542 Sycamore. She's elderly and appears to be in distress. There are blood stains on her clothing, and she seems disoriented. I'm worried she might have fallen or hurt herself. As he spoke to the dispatcher, providing details and answering questions, he watched Mrs. Thompson from the corner of his eye. She had closed her eyes, her breathing shallow but steady. The morning sun highlighted the deep lines in her face, the slight tremor in her hands, the gray pallor of her skin. How long had she been struggling alone? How many days had passed while her condition deteriorated behind closed doors? The sound of approaching sirens cut through his thoughts, growing louder by the second. Mrs. Thompson stirred at the noise, her eyes opening with a flash of fear. It's okay, Darius assured her, reaching for her hand. Help is coming. You're not alone anymore. The words seemed to calm her, and she squeezed his hand weakly. As the emergency vehicles pulled up, their lights painting the quiet street in alternating flashes of red and white, Darius silently thanked whatever instinct had made him pay attention, had made him look closer when something seemed wrong. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, their quest. Ian's precise and professional. Yes, she lived alone. No, she didn't have any family nearby. Yes, she had been taking medication, but she couldn't remember exactly what kind. Through it all, Darius stood nearby, a steady presence in the whirlwind of activity that had descended upon the normally quiet street. As they prepared to transport her to the hospital, Mrs. Thompson suddenly reached out and caught Darius's sleeve. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was so scared. The admission hit Darius like a physical blow. How many others were out there? He wondered, hiding their fear and pain behind closed doors, too proud or too afraid to ask for help. How many struggled silently while the world continued its normal rhythms just outside their windows. The ambulance pulled away, its sirens now silent, leaving Darius standing on the empty porch. The mail bag at his side reminded him of his duties, of the route that still needed to be completed. But as he walked back to his truck, he knew that today he had delivered something far more important than letters and packages. Today he had delivered hope. The rest of his route passed in a blur of mechanical movements and distracted thoughts. The familiar houses seemed different now, each closed door holding the possibility of hidden struggles, each window potentially concealing someone in need. The weight of this new awareness settled on his shoulders, heavier than any mail bag he'd ever carried. As the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky, Darius made a decision. This wouldn't be the end of his involvement. Tomorrow, he would start making calls to social services, to community organizations, to anyone who might be able to help ensure that Mrs. Thompson would have the support she needed. And he would pay more attention, look more closely, listen more carefully, because sometimes the most important deliveries weren't the ones in his bag, but the ones that came from the heart. The afternoon light was turning golden when Darius finally finished his route. As he drove back to the post office, his mind was already forming plans. He thought about his own mother, living alone 3 states away, and made a mental note to call her tonight. The world suddenly seemed both larger and smaller. Larger in its problems and needs, but smaller in the ways people could reach out and help each other. Martha was still at her desk when he returned, finishing up the day's paperwork. She looked up as he approached, probably noticing something different in his expression. "Everything okay out there today, Darius?" He paused, considering how to answer. "No," he said finally, "but it will be." Martha's eyes softened at his response, years of friendship allowing her to read the weight behind his words. She set down her pen and turned her full attention to him, the fluorescent lights of the post office casting long shadows across her concerned face. "Want to talk about it?" Darius sank into the chair beside her desk, the events of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. The distant hum of sorting machines provided a steady backdrop as he recounted what had happened at Mrs. Thompson's house. With each detail he shared, the urgency to do more grew stronger within him. "I can't stop thinking about how long she might have been like that," he confessed, running a hand over his tired face. "How many times did I deliver her mail without noticing something was wrong? How many signs did I miss?" "You can't blame yourself," Martha said firmly, reaching across her desk to pat his hand. "You noticed today, and that's what matters." She paused, then added, "My church runs a program for seniors living alone. Weekly check-ins, help with groceries, that sort of thing." The mention of community support sparked something in Darius's mind. He straightened in his chair, thoughts racing. That's exactly what we need, not just for Mrs. Thompson, but for everyone in her situation. We see these people every day, Martha. We're in a unique position to help. Martha's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're thinking about starting something?" "Maybe," Darius replied, ideas beginning to take shape. "What if we created a network? Mail carriers, neighbors, local organizations, all working together." "We could." The sharp ring of his cell phone interrupted his train of thought. The number was unfamiliar, but something made him answer it immediately. "Hello, Mr. Matthews? This is Nurse Chun from Mercy General Hospital." The voice was professional but kind. "I'm calling about Sarah Thompson. You were listed as her emergency contact when she was admitted today." Darius's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this development, but it made a sad sort of sense. Who else would she have listed? "Yes, how is she?" "She's stable, but we've discovered some concerning issues." "Would you be able to come to the hospital? The doctor would like to discuss her condition with someone who knows her." The irony wasn't lost on Darius. He was probably the closest thing to family Mrs. Thompson had right now, yet all he really knew about her came from brief conversations over 2 decades of mail delivery. "Of course," he heard himself saying. "I'll be there as soon as I can." After hanging up, he looked at Martha, who had already started gathering her things. "Go," she said before he could speak. "I'll handle the paperwork." "And Darius?" She caught his eye. "Whatever you end up planning to help these seniors, count me in." The drive to Mercy General gave Darius time to reflect on the strange turns life could take. This morning, he had been just a mail carrier doing his rounds. Now, he was racing to a hospital to advocate for one of his residents, his mind churning with plans to prevent similar situations from happening to others. The hospital parking lot was nearly full, forcing him to park in the far corner. As he walked toward the entrance, the setting sun painted the building's windows in shades of orange and pink, creating an almost ethereal glow. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a burst of antiseptic-scented air. The emergency department was a maze of controlled chaos. Nurses hurrying between rooms, monitors beeping steadily, worried families clustered in corners. Darius approached the information desk, where a tired-looking receptionist directed him to the 3rd floor. The elevator ride felt eternal. Darius studied his reflection in the polished metal doors. His postal uniform now slightly wrinkled from the long day, the worry lines around his eyes more pronounced than usual. The doors opened to a quieter floor, where the hushed atmosphere seemed to demand whispered conversations and soft footsteps. Nurse Chen met him at the nurse's station, her practical shoes silent on the linoleum floor. She was younger than he expected, but her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Matthews. Dr. Patel will be here shortly to discuss Mrs. Thompson's condition. In the meantime, would you like to see her?" Darius nodded, following the nurse down a corridor lined with identical doors. Room 317 was dimly lit, the rhythmic beeping of monitors creating a mechanical lullaby. Mrs. Thompson looked small in the hospital bed, her silver hair fanned out on the white pillow. She was sleeping, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd found her that morning. She was severely dehydrated, Nurse Chen explained in a low voice. "We found evidence of several falls, some possibly days old. There's also signs of malnutrition, and her medication management has been inconsistent." Each word felt like a personal failure to Darius. How had things gotten this bad? He moved closer to the bed, noting the 4 lines and monitoring equipment with a growing sense of determination. This wouldn't happen again. Not to Mrs. Thompson, not to anyone else on his route if he could help it. "Mr. Matthews?" A new voice drew his attention to the doorway, where a tall woman in a white coat stood consulting a tablet. "I'm Dr. Spetel. Thank you for being here. We need to discuss Mrs. Thompson's situation and her options going forward." The next hour was a crash course in geriatric care and social services. Dr. Patel explained the complexity of Mrs. Thompson's condition, not just the physical injuries from her falls, but the underlying issues that had led to this crisis. Depression following her retirement, increasing isolation, the stubborn independence that had prevented her from seeking help even as her ability to care for herself diminished. "The immediate medical issues we can address," Dr. Patel concluded. "But the bigger concern is what happens after she's discharged. She can't safely live alone without significant support, but she has no family to provide it." "She has me," Darius said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "And she'll have more than just me. I'm going to make sure of that." Dr. Patel studied him thoughtfully. "You know, Mr. Matthews, in my years of practice, I've seen countless elderly patients in similar situations. The ones who recover best are those with strong community support. If you're serious about helping Mrs. Thompson, I could put you in touch with some excellent resources." "I'm serious," Darius assured her. "And not just about Mrs. Thompson. This has opened my eyes to a bigger problem. There are others out there like her, trying to manage alone, too proud or scared to ask for help. We need to do better by them." A soft sound from the bed interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Thompson's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her features until she spotted Darius. "You're still here," she whispered, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Of course I am," he replied, moving to her bedside. "And I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Patel excused herself quietly, leaving them alone in the room. Outside the window, the last rays of sunlight were fading from the sky, but Darius barely noticed. His mind was already racing with plans and possibilities. "I was so foolish," Mrs. Thompson said softly, her voice stronger than it had been that morning. "I knew I needed help, but I couldn't bring myself to ask. Didn't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Darius said firmly. "You're part of our community, and communities take care of their own." As he sat with her, listening to her tentatively share her fears and struggles, Darius's earlier ideas began to crystallize into something more concrete. He thought about Martha's church program, about the other organizations in town that might be willing to help. He thought about his fellow mail carriers, each with their own routes, their own elderly residents they checked on daily. What if they could create a network of support, using the Postal Service's daily presence in every neighborhood as a foundation? Regular check-ins, coordination with local services, a way for seniors to maintain their independence while still having access to help when they needed it. Mrs. Thompson's breathing had evened out. She'd fallen asleep mid-sentence, the medication and exhaustion finally overtaking her. Darius stood quietly, careful not to disturb her rest. Tomorrow would bring challenges and complications, but for now, she was safe. And tomorrow, he would begin the work of ensuring that safety extended to others in their community. As he walked back to his car through the now dark parking lot, Darius's phone buzzed with a text from Martha. Called the church. They're on board. Meeting tomorrow morning to discuss ideas. You in? Darius smiled as he typed his response. The day that had started with a crisis was ending with hope. Hope not just for Mrs. Thompson, but for all the hidden struggles behind the doors along his route. One person couldn't solve everything, but one person could start something that might change everything. The night air was sea. All on his face as he drove home, his postal uniform a reminder of the unique position he held in the community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, he let himself feel the satisfaction of knowing that today, at least, he had done more than deliver mail. He had delivered hope. And somewhere in room 317, Mrs. Thompson slept peacefully, no longer alone in her struggles, while across town, wheels were already in motion to ensure that no one else would have to face their battles in silence. The simple act of a mail carrier paying attention had sparked something larger than himself, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of human connection. As Darius pulled into his driveway, he noticed his elderly neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, struggling with his garbage bins. Without hesitation, he parked his car and walked over to help. It was a small gesture, but today had taught him that small gestures could make all the difference in the world. Thank you, Darius, Mr. Jenkins said gratefully. I was just thinking about getting one of those medical alert buttons. My daughter's been pestering me about it. Actually, Darius replied, I might know of something even better. How would you feel about being part of a community support network? And so, even before the official start of his initiative, the ripples of change were already spreading, one conversation at a time, one connection at a time, one life at a time. The night settled around them as they talked, two neighbors sharing ideas under the stars, while across town, others like Martha were already laying the groundwork for what would become something much bigger than any of them had imagined. The story of Mrs. Thompson and her mail carrier was just the beginning, a catalyst for change in a community that was about to discover just how strong it could be when its members looked out for one another. And it all started with one person paying attention, one person deciding to make a difference, one person refusing to look away from someone in need. That conversation with Mr. Jenkins stretched late into the evening, evolving from a simple discussion about medical alerts into something far more meaningful. As they sat on Mr. Jenkins' porch, the streetlights casting a warm glow around them, other neighbors began to notice the impromptu gathering. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street wandered over, then the Chin family from next door. Soon, what had started as a casual chat transformed into an informal neighborhood meeting. Mr. Jenkins said, leaning forward in his chair, I've lived here for 40 years, and this is the first time we've all sat down together like this. His eyes, bright despite his age, scanned the small crowd that had gathered. Maybe that's part of the problem. Darius listened as stories began to flow. Tales of lonely evenings, of struggling with daily tasks that had once been simple, of wanting to help but not knowing how. The Chin's teenage daughter, Lisa, sat cross-legged on the porch steps, typing furiously on her phone. I'm creating a group chat, she explained when she noticed Darius watching. And maybe we could make an app? Something simple, where people could post if they need help with anything. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and soon others were building on the idea. Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired software developer, offered to help design the app. Nothing fancy, she said, but something that could connect people who need help with those who can provide it. Her hands moved animatedly as she described potential features, her technical expertise blending seamlessly with her understanding of the community's needs. As the night deepened, the group's energy didn't wane. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger with each new idea, each shared story. Mr. Jenkins' wife appeared with coffee and cookies, and the informal meeting took on the feeling of a family gathering. Children played quietly in the yard while their parents and grandparents planned and discussed, the generations mixing naturally in a way that seemed both novel and deeply right. We could have weekly dinners, suggested Mrs. Chun, her accent thick with excitement. Different houses each time. In my culture, sharing food is how we build community. The idea was met with enthusiastic nods, and soon a schedule was being drafted on the back of an old envelope. Darius watched it all unfold with a sense of wonder. He thought about Mrs. Thompson in her hospital bed, unaware that her situation had sparked something that was already growing beyond what he had initially imagined. This wasn't just about checking on the elderly anymore. It was about rebuilding the connections that modern life had slowly eroded. As midnight approached, the group had developed the framework for something they tentatively called the Neighborhood Watch and Care Network. It would start small, their street first, then expanding outward. They would use technology to coordinate, but rely on old-fashioned human connection to make it work. Lisa had already created a basic website, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard while others contributed ideas. Mrs. Rodriguez was sketching out app wireframes on a notepad. Mr. Jenkins had called his daughter, a social worker in another state, who was offering professional advice via speakerphone. The key, she explained, her voice crackling through the phone speaker, is to make it sustainable. Don't try to do everything at once. Start small, build slowly, and make sure everyone feels both supported and empowered to contribute. The group nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. They began assigning roles based on people's strengths and availability. The Chin family, who ran a local restaurant, offered to coordinate meal deliveries. Mrs. Rodriguez would handle the technical aspects. Mr. Jenkins, despite his own age, insisted on being part of the regular check-in team. Just because I'm old doesn't mean I can't help, he said firmly. Sometimes what people need most is someone who understands what they're going through. As the meeting finally began to wind down, Darius felt a profound sense of rightness. This was how communities were supposed to work. People coming together, each contributing what they could, no one left to struggle alone. He thought about his route, about all the houses he passed each day, and imagined this network spreading, growing, strengthening the bonds between neighbors one connection at a time. The next morning, Darius arrived at the post office earlier than usual. Martha was already there, surrounded by pamphlets and notes from her church's senior program. Her face lit up when she saw him. "You won't believe what happened last night," they both said simultaneously, then laughed. As they compared notes, Martha's meeting with church leaders, Darius's impromptu neighborhood gathering. It became clear that they were building something bigger than either had initially planned. Martha's church had resources and experience. The neighborhood group had energy and innovative ideas. Together, they could create something truly impactful. "We need to talk to the postmaster," Martha said suddenly. "If we're going to use our routes to help identify people in need, we should make it official." She paused, then added with a smile, "Plus, imagine if we could get other post offices involved. This could spread beyond just our town." Darius thought about Mrs. Thompson again, imagining her returning to a home that was no longer just a house, but part of a caring community. He thought about all the other Mrs. Thompsons out there, struggling alone behind closed doors. This network they were building could change lives, not just for those who needed help, but for everyone involved. The morning sun streamed through the post office windows as they began their day's work, but everything felt different now. Each letter he sorted, each package he prepared for delivery, seemed like more than just mail. They were potential connections, opportunities to strengthen the web of community they were weaving. His phone buzzed with messages from the neighborhood group chat. Lisa had finished a basic version of the website. Mrs. Rodriguez had recruited some of her former tech colleagues to help with the app. Mr. Jenkins had already started a list of other seniors in the area who might need support. As Darius loaded his truck for the day's route, he smiled, thinking about how much had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, he had been a mail carrier who noticed something wrong and took action. Today, he was part of something much larger, a movement growing from the simple idea that no one should have to face life's challenges alone. The morning air was crisp as he began his route, the familiar streets now holding new meaning. Behind each door might be someone who needed help, someone who could offer help, or both. The network they were building would connect them all, turning a collection of houses into a true community. His first stop was the hospital. Mrs. Thompson was awake, looking stronger than the day before. When he told her about what her situation had inspired, the neighborhood meeting, the plans for the network, the way people had come together, tears welled up in her eyes. "All my life," she said softly, "I've been the one helping others. It was so hard to admit I needed help myself. But maybe that's part of what community means. Sometimes you give help, and sometimes you receive it. Darius sat with her for a while, sharing more details about the network they were creating. With each element he described, he could see her enthusiasm growing. By the time he left to continue his route, she was making plans of her own for how she could contribute once she recovered. The rest of his day was a blur of deliveries interspersed with community building. At each stop, he found himself having brief but meaningful conversations. People had heard about what was happening. News traveled fast in small towns and wanted to be involved. A retired nurse offered to help coordinate medical check-ins. A high school student proposed creating instructional videos to help seniors use the app they were developing. A local grocery store owner suggested a delivery service for those who couldn't shop for themselves. By the time Darius finished his route, the network had grown far beyond his initial vision. What had started as a crisis response to one woman's situation was evolving into a comprehensive community support system. And at its heart was a simple truth. Everyone had something to give, and everyone at some point had something they needed. That evening, as he sat in another planning meeting, this one at the church, with both his neighborhood group and Martha's church members in attendance, Darius felt a deep sense of purpose. They were building something important, something that could change lives. The room buzzed with energy as people shared ideas, made plans, and formed connections. The walls between different parts of the community, young and old, longtime residents and newcomers, church members and secular volunteers, were dissolving, replaced by a shared commitment to taking care of one another. As he looked around the room, Darius realized that this was more than just a support network they were creating. It was a reminder of what community could be, of what it should be. And it had all started with one simple act of paying attention, of refusing to look away when someone was in need. The meeting ran late into the night, but no one seemed to mind. They were too busy building something meaningful, too engaged in the process of turning compassion into action. And somewhere in a hospital room across town, Mrs. Thompson slept peacefully, unaware that her moment of crisis had become a catalyst for positive change. Throughout the entire community, the transformation of Copper Hill continued with remarkable speed over the next few weeks. What had started in that hospital room blossomed into a movement that touched every corner of the community. The morning after that productive church meeting, Darius arrived at work to find the postmaster, Richard Coleman, waiting by his truck. "Martha told me everything," Coleman said, his usually stern expression softened by interest. "I've been thinking about it all night. This could be revolutionary for the Postal Service's role in community care." He pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. "I made some calls to the regional office. They're interested in turning this into a pilot program." Darius listened, amazed as Coleman outlined the possibilities. The Postal Service could formally integrate community welfare checks into their regular routes. They could develop training programs for carriers to recognize signs of distress. They could create official protocols for intervention when needed. But that's just the beginning, Coleman continued, his excitement growing visible. "I've got the mayor calling me, the county commissioner wants to meet, and 3 other post offices in the region are asking how they can implement similar programs." The news spread through the postal office like wildfire. Carriers from other routes began sharing their own stories of elderly residents they worried about, of subtle signs they'd noticed but hadn't known how to address. By lunchtime, what had started as Darius's informal initiative was evolving into a structured program with official backing. Meanwhile, the neighborhood network was taking on a life of its own. Lisa Chen's website had gone live, featuring a user-friendly interface that connected those needing help with those offering it. Mrs. Rodriguez and her tech team had developed a basic version of the app, which they named Community Bridge. Local businesses began signing up as partners, offering everything from discounted services to volunteer coordination. But the real magic was happening in the small, daily interactions. Mr. Jenkins, true to his word, had become an unofficial ambassador for the program. His age and experience made him particularly effective at reaching out to other seniors who might be hesitant to ask for help. "It's about dignity," he explained to Darius one evening, as they sat reviewing the week's activities. "When I talk to them, they know I understand. I'm not just some young person telling them what to do. I'm a peer saying, 'I've been there, and it's okay to need help. The impact was visible throughout the community. Gardens that had been neglected were coming back to life as volunteer teams helped with maintenance. Empty porches now hosted regular gatherings. The local community center, which had been struggling with low attendance, suddenly found itself bustling with activity as it became a hub for network meetings and social events. Mrs. Thompson's recovery became a symbol of what they were building. After 2 weeks in the hospital, she was transferred to a rehabilitation facility, where her progress exceeded everyone's expectations. The regular stream of visitors from the network, not just checking on her, but genuinely engaging with her, seemed to fuel her determination to get better. "I never knew I had so many friends," she told Darius during one of his visits. She was sitting up in a chair by the window. Color returned to her cheeks, her silver hair neatly styled again. "All these years, I thought I was alone, but they were there all along. We were all just waiting for someone to make the first move." The rehabilitation facility itself had become an unexpected partner in the network. Impressed by the community support Mrs. Thompson received, they began working with the program to develop better transition plans for other patients returning home. Social workers collaborated with network volunteers to ensure continuous support for those who needed it. One particularly innovative development came from an unexpected source. Lisa Chun, inspired by her work on the website, had started a technology mentorship program. High school students were paired with seniors to teach them how to use smartphones, tablets, and computers effectively. The program quickly became about more than just technology. It was building bridges between generations. "You should see Mr. Martinez," Lisa told Darius excitedly one morning as he delivered mail to the Chun family restaurant. "He's not just learning to use the app. He's teaching us about his experiences during the civil rights movement. We're recording his stories for a history project now." The local media began to take notice. The Copper Hill Gazette ran a front-page story about the network, featuring Mrs. Thompson's story and the remarkable community response it had inspired. Regional news stations sent reporters to cover what they called the Copper Hill model of community care. But it was the smaller stories that really showed the impact of what they'd created. Like the time Mrs. Rodriguez's app connected a young mother struggling with postpartum depression to a retired therapist who lived just 3 doors down. Or when Mr. Chin's restaurant coordinated with the network to ensure that no senior in the community ate alone during the holidays. The postal carriers became the eyes and ears of the network, their daily rounds providing a natural framework for regular check-ins. They developed a subtle but effective system of flags, literal and metaphorical, to identify those who might need extra support. Other communities began sending representatives to learn how they could implement similar programs. Darius found his role evolving as well. While he still delivered mail with the same dedication as always, he had become something of a community coordinator, the threads of various initiatives running through his daily route. He knew which houses needed checking, which volunteers were available, which resources could be mobilized when needed. The network's success brought challenges too. As it grew, they had to figure out how to maintain the personal touch that made it effective while handling the increasing scale of operations. They learned to balance formal structures with informal connections, professional services with neighborly help. One evening, about a month after Mrs. Thompson's crisis, Darius stood at the back of the community center's main hall, watching as people filtered in for one of their regular network meetings. The room was a microcosm of their success. Seniors chatting with teenagers about technology, business owners discussing volunteer schedules with retirees, medical professionals conferring with postal workers about monitoring protocols. Mrs. Thompson sat near the front, now fully recovered and serving as one of the network's most passionate advocates. She caught Darius's eye and smiled, the kind of smile that carried the weight of everything they'd built together. She was no longer just the woman he delivered mail to. She had become a symbol of what was possible when a community decided to truly care for its own. The meeting began with updates from various committees, but it quickly evolved into a celebration of small victories. A successful emergency response to a fallen senior, a new partnership with the local pharmacy for medication management, a grant secured for expanding the technology program. As Darius listened to the reports and watched the interactions, he realized they had created something far more significant than a safety net. They had rebuilt the very fabric of community life, weaving together the diverse threads of their town into something stronger and more beautiful than before. The Postal Service's official pilot program was set to launch the following week, with Copper Hill as its model. Other towns were already adapting their framework to their own communities. These started with one observant mail carrier noticing something wrong, had grown into a movement that promised to change how communities across the country cared for their vulnerable members. But perhaps the most profound change was the simplest one. People no longer felt alone. Behind every door along Darius's route, residents knew they were part of something larger than themselves, connected to a network of care that would be there when they needed it. As the meeting continued, plans were made, challenges were addressed, and new ideas were proposed. But underlying it all was the fundamental truth that had started everything. Sometimes the smallest acts of attention and care could spark the biggest changes. And in Copper Hill, those changes were just beginning. The sun had set by the time the meeting ended, but the energy in the room remained high. As people gathered their things and said their goodbyes, there was a palpable sense of purpose in the air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, new chances to strengthen the bonds they'd built. And somewhere in the quiet evening, a mail carrier's badge caught the light of a street lamp, a simple symbol of service that had become something more, a reminder that every person, every job, every small act of kindness could be the catalyst for profound change.